Today we're going to be going over the history of the printing press, and I just kind of wanted to give you, a rundown of the timeline and the impact it had on design in general. So, where does it begin? Where did printing come from? Well, uh, China actually. They were the first to develop two specific types of printing methods. They were the first to develop paper, and they came up with a solution for ink to put words onto that paper with. So we're going to cover their advancements first. The two methods I'm talking about are stamp seals and ink rubbings. It's not really known who came up with those methods, but they were in widespread use throughout China up until the point to where movable type was in widespread use in the West. They were actually the first to come up with the concept of movable type as well, carving their letter forms into wooden blocks before stamping them, much like stamp seals, into documents in manual order. But because of the complexity of their language and the amount of characters in it, it never really was adopted fully. On the other hand, Western printers totally adopted this, and we're going to cover Gutenberg in a little while. Paper made its way to the West through Samarkand after the Battle of Talas, when captured Chinese papermakers gave the secret to Arabs. Probably not by choice, but sometimes dark things occur, I guess, in the path towards great things being spread, unfortunately. And Gutenberg kind of has a story like that too, where there's lots of financial problems, and there's he's kind of like the architect behind the mass production of printing that we know today. Books were originally made manually, handwritten, hand-drawn sometimes. Gutenberg. We're going to talk about Gutenberg now. As I said, he's the main architect of the printing press, of movable typography, and of the starting of automation, really. But Coster was an influence as well, coming up with the concept of typographic composition with his experimental use of reusable wooden typesets. Now let's cover what movable typography is. It's an important component of this system, this printing press, comprised of metal or wooden blocks with type carved or stamped out, a matrix that these fit into, and the cast lead. And what they did is they set into the machine, and then manually people could feed paper through. And I believe automation came along eventually, but Gutenberg's process was a manual paper feed with the press stamping down blocks of these typesets, all framed properly to make a document at once. So you could do a whole page at once without having to hand draw anything, or it was much more efficient, to the point to where it was able to do 250 sheets an hour, which at the time was unheard of. I mean, they were doing them by hand, so one sheet probably took a day if you're really taking your time and making it look good. This absolutely revolutionized the production of printed and readable goods, which is important because it made literacy possible, right? You can't have literacy if you don't have books, ways to read. And the mass production of books allowed for the common people, who for the most part were illiterate, to start becoming literate. And we're going to fast forward a bit now. By the late 18th century, 400 years after Gutenberg, but only a third of the amount of time it took for the invention of printing to become what Gutenberg made, right? Because instead of around 1200 years, it was a third of that, 400. Innovations such as steam power, metal presses, power-driven cylinder presses, all of these innovations came around that brought the maximum paper output to 8,000 sheets from 250 in just 400 years. That's the amount of innovation that happened. I think that's pretty impressive. I was impressed by that. And then just another 100 years later, electric power came and allowed minor mechanical improvements like automatic feeding and better plate and paper registration because it's more accurate, things like that, right? And by the time we're in the late 1900s, we have offset printing, A blanket cylinder runs continuously while another cylinder presses paper onto it, even further increasing the paper output, right? This new process comes out, it makes color printing more manageable. The offset presses could do multiple colors at once, and it was much harder to do that with the standard metal printing presses, or in some cases even impossible, right? So all of these innovations are happening. It's in 500 years we have insane automation happening, and you can argue that electric power and steam power brought innovations in all industries, right? But we're covering printing here, so that's what we're talking about. All right, now we're getting awfully close to modern times, so we're going to keep it a bit brief here. Computers in the late 1900s and the early 2000s allowed for even more automation, much more accurate numbers regarding registration and placement and just really everything. Computers kind of changed the game when it comes to printing, which really computers are just kind of like the next step. And interestingly enough, since we're talking about books and the automation of books, computers are kind of like the next step for a book, right? Because what is a book but a form of recorded information? And a computer is a tool that is used to access information. So that's kind of my tie-in for why a computer is kind of the next evolution of a book, because it's a tool to access information, and that's, in my head, the simplest definition for a book. But let's break off that tangent now, and let's go into the impact that printing has had on design. Printing has had an enormous impact on design. The origins of printing in China allowed for society to own and appreciate art from a wider perspective. It opened options up for designers and artists, and it provided the basework and foundation of commercial printing later. Gutenberg's advancements in movable typography allowed for the automation of book creation, which until that point had been done completely by hand. We'll look at a couple more examples of that here. This technology in turn paved the way for true commercial printing, with steam power first, then electric power, and finally computerized printing on demand. All of these advancements had tangible benefits to design in the time and also for future innovations. One could even argue that a computer is simply the next evolution of a book. So in some ways, I wouldn't even have been able to make this video or post it without the advancements made in print technology. Alright, if you enjoyed watching, please subscribe, and thank you, because I really appreciate it.